The first question comes from, in the studio, it's from Anna Edgerton.
Senator Brandis, the Abbott government has plans to repeal Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act, which they claim is a form of censorship of free speech. Do you really think that overtly racist remarks, such as those of Andrew Bolt regarding light-skinned Aborigines, are not only socially acceptable, but necessary to political discourse in the 21st century?
George Brandis.
Well, you are right when you say that we made a commitment to repeal Section 18C in its current form, and we're going to do that. And you're right to identify the Bolt case as the episode that, as it were, catalysed this debate nearly 2 years ago. Regardless of whether you agree with what Mr. Bolt said, whether you were offended by it, whether you think that it was a deplorable thing to say, or whether you agreed with it, our view is that it's not the role of the government to tell people what they are allowed to think, and it's not the role of the government to tell people what opinions they are allowed to express. And if, as is obvious from your question, you strongly disapprove of what Mr. Bolt had to say, then in our view, that's a matter for civil society to make that judgment. It's not a matter of the government passing laws to censor the expression of opinions that are unpopular or offensive to mainstream society.
Senator, we'll go back to our questioner. She had her hand up and then we'll hear from the rest of the panel.
Senator Brandis, given that people in power such as yourself already have a public platform in which to express their opinions, surely the minority groups that don't share the same status, your freedom of expression should be curtailed when it's being used to target and vilify oppressed groups. Why is your right to make offensive comments more important than their right to be free from racial discrimination?
I absolutely disagree with you. If you're going to have a free society, then everybody's right to express their opinions has to be respected. Minorities, majorities, disempowered people, powerful people, everyone's right to express opinions has to be respected. And the vice we see in Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act is that it doesn't do that. The moment you go down the path that you're suggesting, you set up the government as a censor of opinion. And in a free country, that could never be allowed.
Let's hear from Marcia Langton.
Well, I find it very difficult to agree with your government's proposition on this matter, Senator Brandis. One only has to look at, say, the code of behaviour with the NRL or the AFL, and if you have your way and you repeal Section 18C, the place where people of colour, like myself, and unfortunately this is never going to be the case, will feel safe from racial abuse is on an AFL team or in the NRL. And everywhere else in society where there are not such codes of behaviour will be targets. And it's not true that this, in my opinion, that the simple argument about freedom of speech applies in this case, because there is also, I believe, a right of people like myself to feel free from racial discrimination. And especially from racial vilification in public speech and publication.
Well, I agree with that up to a point. I agree with you up to a point, Professor Langton, but I think you're running together two quite different things. One, you are running together racial vilification with the expression of opinions that members of a particular racial group might find offensive, and they're not the same things. I agree that it is a matter of drawing the line, but we can structure and write our laws so that we respect freedom of opinion and at the same time protect members of ethnic minorities or racial minorities from vilification, which isn't the expression of opinion, by the way. It's the utterance of abusive or threatening words.
All right, there's going to be a little bit of discussion around this. I'd like to hear from the other panellists before we come back and hear your views again. So let's hear from Lisa Wilkinson.
I'm a passionate believer in freedom of speech, but not if that freedom of speech allows somebody to racially vilify or humiliate or marginalise or isolate a particular group. And I think that's what 18C is about, stopping having happen. And if there's going to be freedom of expression, that has to be balanced with freedom from oppression. And I think that's what also 18C is about. And really, it's about the rules of the playground applying in adult life outside of the playground, where bullies are no longer allowed to bully and get away with it.
Can I quickly jump in here, because the Andrew Bolt case was mentioned earlier, and I'm just wondering, do you have a view as to whether that was a tantamount to bullying? What he said,
It certainly went down that path, and I'm never comfortable with a particular marginalised section of society being spoken about in that way.
Let's hear from the rest of our panel. Sherry Markson.
Look, the newspaper I work for, The Australian, supports freedom of speech very strongly, and they do support the repeal of 18C. But I personally have a different view. I agree with you, Lisa. I think that the Jewish communities, the Muslim, the Korean, the Vietnamese, the Chinese communities are quite strong on this, and they deserve to be protected from humiliation based on their race. And I know that last year, a whole number of very anti-Semitic Facebook sites emerged. This hasn't been publicly reported before. And the Jewish Board of Deputies had absolutely no way of having them pulled down. Facebook flat out refused to pull them down. And it wasn't until they took it to the Human Rights Commission and invoked 18C that they finally got this hugely offensive material pulled down. So I personally would err on the side of caution, and I think even though it'll impact on freedom of speech, it does more good than harm to keep the act as it is.
Chris Byrne.
I think this is deeply concerning. Now, if you listen to George Brandis and accept that frame, you'd think this was the only restriction on freedom of speech in Australia, and of course that's a nonsense. None of us can defame each other tonight. None of us can say something which is untrue and outrageous. There's a restriction on freedom of speech. If you're in business, you can't engage in misleading conduct. As a Member of Parliament, I can't come in here tonight and say the Speaker is biased. I'd be in contempt of the Parliament. So of course there are restrictions in a modern society on freedom of speech. And this is a very important protection. Why? Because we don't want a society where it's okay to insult somebody because of their race. And this law has a history. It wasn't introduced for fun. It was introduced as a result of a recommendation, a Royal Commission into racial violence, because racial vilification leads to racial violence. And we don't want to live in a society where that's regarded as okay. And this really just balances up the ledger a bit. If you're a person who isn't very powerful and you're in a situation where you're vilified, this gives you a chance to have a say. Most cases don't even get to court. They get conciliated and they're sorted out in a room where a person says, you can't talk to me about that, like that, or about me like that. And we hear a lot about the Bolt case. Well, I don't want to have a situation in Australia where things like the Tobin case are acceptable, where somebody can say the Holocaust was made up as part of a Jewish conspiracy, and that's all right. It's not okay.
You're not putting Andrew Bolt's comments and Holocaust deniers in the same.
But they've both been dealt with under this clause of the Act. That's the point I'm making, and that is not okay for that to be allowed to happen in Australia. People have a right to be respected and not to be insulted because of their race or nationality. And it's not just simply the person involved who has to take offence. A judge has to decide that a reasonable person would take offence. That's quite a hard test, and judges have said that this would have to be a very serious thing that was said, not something trivial. And there are also protections in the Act for matters of art and scientific discussion.
Chris, I'm going to interrupt you because we've got a few people with their hands up.